Good morning, everybody. We are going to do a slideshow today. I wanted to try out this format because I think that it's really helpful sometimes to be able to show you guys what I'm doing on the computer. And I was going to do it live, but I had some trouble last time when I was using my computer to do a Facebook Live. So we're going to pre-record and see how this works. You can see me down here looking like a little air traffic controller. I do have different microphones that are more professional looking, but I swear this one works the best. So you get to deal with me and my gigantic headphones. Today we're going to be talking about weird U.S. censuses, and why you shouldn't ignore them, even though they're really, really easy to ignore because they're a little bit harder, well, they're a lot harder to find sometimes than regular censuses. And I'm sorry for all of my international friends if this is really boring to you because you don't have any relatives in the US, but yeah, it's the way it goes. Okay, so special censuses, the weird censuses. They don't capture everybody. None of them have everybody on them. The only censuses that were really for everybody were just the general basic, 1900, 1910, 1920 censuses. The special ones were designed to capture unique segments of the population. They don't happen every year. They're actually a little inconsistent, which is part of the reason that it's hard to remember, okay, so what year should I be looking for this extra information? And unfortunately, not all of them still exist. And not all of them exist online, which does make them harder. So you might know that your ancestor is probably on one of the special censuses, but you're going to have to go the extra mile to figure out if that census hasn't been digitized, where can you find a copy? And is it one of the ones that's been destroyed? Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about was for defective, dependent, and delinquent people. That one happened in 1880. So this one was for people who were physically disabled, mentally ill, for homeless children, or for prison inmates. And the thing about this is that these people were not only captured on this special census. This is a supplement to the regular census. So these people would have been on the regular census as well. So if you're looking for your ancestor, what you do is you find them on the 1880 census, and then make sure that you look to see if there's any check marks in columns 15 through 20. I've got this, blurry, photo of that part of the census right here. And if there's a mark, then you should be looking for them in the special census. You're not always going to find them. Here you can see some marks in column 15, which is if people are sick or temporarily disabled. Then you see sometimes in communities you go through and it's like every single household somebody has a mark. Well, it's because people like communities kind of got sick together. So you're more likely to find them on the special census if they actually have check marks in columns 16 through 20, because those are, more permanent, or, I guess being insane isn't a permanent way of being, but those are you're going to find special information about those people versus if somebody just has a cold and is at home. But if you've got a check mark in column 15, you still want to look, because sometimes those people do also show up on the special census with more information about the illness that was troubling them. This is a look at the actual, that census, that supplemental census. So, you've got insane inhabitants in Carthage, in Ohio. And then you've got, it says, form of disease. You've got dementia, mania, I think this is a dipsomania. Anyway, you have to remember that this could have been depression. It could have been menopause or postpartum syndrome for women. It could have been, lots of things. And so you might be surprised to find an ancestor on this supplemental schedule, but there were lots of reasons that people might end up on there. And it does give more information. It talks about how long they've been ill, the age at which the first attack occurred, things like that. So, and it will probably give information about where they are or where they've been treated in the past. And depending on where that is, you might be able to find records in that place as well. So again, this is information that you want because it's going to tell you more about their story. Okay, so agriculture censuses, not maybe as thrilling as finding out that you had somebody who was committed to an asylum, but agricultural censuses actually give a whole lot of information because they if you've got an ancestor who was on a farm, which a lot of us do, if you have ancestors from the United States, you have lists of all the produce and the livestock and what, the machinery and things like that, like what the value of the farm was. So 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880, those are the years where we're going to find an agriculture census. They were actually taken all the way up through 1910, but 1890 through 1910 have been destroyed. The 1890 census, the agriculture census, went the way of the 1890 census. It burnt up in that big fire. And then, unfortunately, the 1900 and 1910 censuses were destroyed by the federal government without being microfilmed. I have no idea why, but they were destroyed, and so we don't have access to them anymore. So in 1850 and 1860, the farm had to be worth 100 or more annually, and then in 1870 or 1880, it was farmed to 3 or more acres or worth more than 500 annually. So if you have an ancestor who lived out in the country and had a vegetable garden that they used to, feed the household, but they were in some other kind of labor or something like that, or the farm wasn't that kind of money maker, then you won't find a census. You won't find them in the special census. But anybody who was engaged in farming as a business was it was likely that they were going to meet this threshold. So look for them. This is a copy of, this is in San Rafael, in California. And you've got this one farmer, and it talks about, how many acres of land, what's the value of the farm, the labor, what kind of grass. So, just interesting stuff. Again, this is that thing of like, well, I already found them on the regular census. Why would I care about all this extra stuff? If your goal is to only find somebody on a census and prove that they existed and then not look into their life, I can honestly say genealogy might not be the best hobby for you. Just because if your goal is just to prove that you had a great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, you did. We know that because you exist. So it just is one of those things where sometimes I'm surprised by people who are like, oh, as long as I have the name, then I don't really care about anything else. I think that's weird. So I don't know why you wouldn't want more information. But again, maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, I think you're weird. Well, fair enough. Okay, moving on. So manufacturing and industry. I think these are as good as agricultural censuses, but then I talk to people and I feel like nobody uses these and I don't know why. So this covers manufacturers, miners, or, not the specific miners working in the mine, but the actual mine itself, fisheries, mercantile, commercial businesses, trading businesses, things like that. And it'll list the company or the owner, maybe both, the type of business, capital invested, and the value of materials. And it's not going to list the employees, but if you know where your ancestor worked, then you can look at information about that place of business, and it's going to tell you a lot about, things that would have affected your ancestor. And there is one that was done in 1810. It's mostly gone. It's been destroyed, but there's like a few pages left. So who knows? Maybe you'll hit the lottery and your ancestors will be among the few that have been saved. But yeah, just because your ancestor wasn't the owner of a company doesn't mean that the company information wouldn't have affected them in a pretty big way. So especially if you don't know a lot about the place where your ancestor worked, then this can be really interesting and helpful. And if you're in that like 1850, 1860, if that's when your ancestor is listed there, or is, that your ancestor's working there, then it can also show you a picture about how that industry was changing over time, which I think is really interesting from an American history standpoint. So here's from New York, here's a manufacturing schedule. And I've zoomed in here. This can be kind of hard to read, but you've got this confectionery at the top, and then it's talking about, okay, what's the capital? How many people are employed? What are the wages and the hours of labor? Which again, if your ancestor is just an employee, that's still really interesting because then you have a general idea of what they made. How many months were they in operation? I think this is as interesting as the farm schedules. Okay, so slave schedules. Only exist for 1850 and 1860, and the slave schedules list the name of the owners, but doesn't list the names of the enslaved people. So this can be frustrating if you know that your ancestor was enslaved, but you aren't, and you're not going to find enslaved people on the general population census. They're only going to be on this slave schedule. It does list the age, the sex, the color, and some other details. It'll list whether or not they're a fugitive. I think it might list I think both of them actually list whether or not they're disabled or, insane, idiotic. So what you can do is you can look, if you have a general idea of where your enslaved ancestors were, then you look in that area and you're looking for people who match the age and the sex, and any other details. I mean, the frustrating thing is, of course, if that's all you're going off of, you can end up with quite a few people who fit the same description, but that's where you start to do research. And then what you do is you look into records, based off of the name of the owners. You see if you can find bills of sale that have more information that maybe match names, but it narrows down that pool of, okay, this is the list of people in the area who owned an enslaved person who matches the description of what I think my ancestor, it's extra work, but that's how you use slave schedule. And if your ancestor is listed as the owner, then this gives you a look at their life. You can also, if you're interested, then you can look at bills of sale or look for bills of sale and other property things that list your ancestor as owning and trading in enslaved people, and find information about that way. And here's a look. It's hard. I mean, that's the thing. Of all the schedules, these are always so sad because, especially when you look, this top one, there are a number of people listed, and this is very common that a lot of these people are very young. So you've got a 15-year-old female, a 13-year-old female, an 8-year-old female, a 6-year-old male, a 4-year-old male, a 3-year-old male, and then a 5-month-old male. As somebody who has young children, it's I cannot imagine. I just can't imagine, it's one of those things. But I think that this is not you don't want to ignore this special census because it's painful to look at. This is another part of American history, and it's important that we don't gloss over it because it's, more convenient to not tell that part of the story. I really strongly believe that. So, yeah. So that's what that looks like. Okay, so mortality schedules. Mortality schedules are a little bit weird. There's 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, and there's also one for 1885. They kind of did weird schedules in 1885. It's almost like they were looking into the future, knowing that we were going to do a schedule in 1890 and then we were going to set it on fire. But there is an 1885 schedule for some areas. And then the 1900 schedule only survived for Minnesota, which again, it's just weird. Mortality schedules are just weird. So what the mortality schedules were for was they recorded the names of people who died during the 12-month period prior to the official census date. So it's not like January of 1849 to, December 31st. It says on the top of the census, but it's like this weird middle of the year thing, like from June to May, I think is the one that I pulled up as a sample. So the thing about mortality schedules is that you don't have people who are listed on the general schedule and then there's not a check mark being like, oh, this person's actually dead. Like if they were deceased when the census taker came around, then they didn't put you on the general, 1860 schedule. So they're really only helpful if you know that your ancestor died at specific times. So, and again, it's 1849, but it's not, because it's a very specific part of 1849 and then probably also part of 1850. But if you have somebody who died in that time neighborhood, then you might find them on the mortality schedule, and it'll give you more information about their death. The other reason to look at mortality schedules, even if you don't have an ancestor who died during that time, is that it tells you about community life, because it tells you what people were dying of. You can you see the names of diseases, the historic names of diseases and that changing. People in different communities were dying from different things. People from impoverished communities were more likely to die from certain things, tuberculosis, malnutrition, versus other areas. So sometimes the mortality schedules are just interesting to look at. But they're strange. They are a strange little supplement. And here is a mortality schedule in Florida. And you can see that it talks about the profession of the deceased person. It talks about the cause of death. You've got consumption, pneumonia, dropsy of chest. That dropsy is like edema. and how long they'd been sick, the name of the doctor, which again, if you, maybe there's a chance that the doctor kept records. I mean, I have to admit it's a pretty slim chance from that far back, but there's a chance. So yeah, if you have an ancestor who happens to be on this, in this little window of time, it's odd because it's one of those things where they really cared about who died in the 12 months prior. The other 9 years, they weren't doing this. So I don't know. Okay, so social statistics. Sorry, my little, can I move this around? Not without messing everything up. Okay, so social statistics. This is not individuals. Individuals are never named on social statistic schedules. What they are is they're these detailed looks at communities. And they're interesting because you want to know more about the community that your ancestors were living in. Again, that tells you more about their lives. But it talks about taxes, which would have affected your ancestors specifically. And then it names a lot of things, including schools, newspapers, and then churches and some other stuff. But the thing about the schools, newspapers, and churches is that tells you the names of places where you may want to look to see, okay, have records been archived? Are copies of this newspaper, this little local newspaper, are they available somewhere, maybe at a historical society? Maybe they haven't been digitized and they're not widely available. But if I go to this library, I can look through, old records and see if there's an obituary or something for my family member. So, in addition to just being interesting because it tells you more about the communities that your ancestors lived in, social statistics schedules can actually be really helpful as jumping off points for new research leads. So here's a look at the social statistics. And as you can see, it's really, the only individual on this page is the enumerator. And so, but this tells you, this is a place in Michigan. It tells you, the valuation of the community, taxation, libraries, things like that, how many schools were available. But then down here, they've written in the names of the newspapers and the periodicals. And then you've got a number of, it doesn't have the names of the churches, but it has the number of people in the community who were a certain religion. And communities really did tend to be where you had a large part of the community going to one specific church. So if you don't know anything about your family's religious life, then maybe that would give you at least a hint as to, well, statistically speaking, your ancestor seems to have likely been Episcopal if they were living in this part of Michigan at the time. So look at those churches first, and you'll have, statistically speaking, you'll have a better chance of finding records in those churches before you move on to the other ones. But yeah, I mean, there's interesting information on these. Okay, so American Indian schedules. These, so I put 1880, 1900, 1910. It's not actually that cut and dry. The American Indian schedules happened randomly at different times. They happen at different times in different areas. They're kind of a mess, but there were censuses for the Indian reservations that exist for a period of time. There were school censuses, and all of these censuses are different. And then in 1880, 1920, 1930, American Indians are enumerated on the general population schedules. But if they aren't taxed, then you might find them on the inquiries relating to Indians. Sorry, my photos over that information again. But if you have ancestors that you believe should be on a schedule like that, you want to see if you can dig around and find them. There have been big efforts to get those digitized because that's obviously a part of American history that we don't want to lose because it's a huge part of the story. And if you can find your ancestors, it can give you the name of the tribe, the type of dwelling, Indian name is what my photo is over there, tribal status, and other general census information like age, sex, marital status, and things like that. Here's a picture of an Indian census roll from 1931, Montana. And they aren't consistent, like depending on when and where you're going to find different information. This one has the names, surnames, but also has the tribe. It has the degree of blood. So it's the degree of Native American blood. And where they are enrolled. So here you can see that this person's at a different reservation or a different location than the reservation where they're enrolled. And whether or not they are a ward, it's it's interesting information. The school ones, I didn't actually pull up a sample for the school ones. School ones are, again, a little bit sad because the kids are so little and you see all their little English names and then the Indian name is sometimes listed separately. But again, if it's your history, if it's part of your family's story, you don't want to ignore it just because it is inconvenient or difficult to research or emotionally difficult. Okay, so military service. There were also some special censuses that came out of military service. They kind of jump around as far as when and where and what they were talking about. In 1840, there was one for Revolutionary War pensioners, which is nice because, those earlier censuses before 1840 really don't have a ton of information on them. So Civil War Veteran Schedule in 1890, there is a schedule from 1890, which is exciting because that could be the only 1890 information you have for your family. It's mostly the Union, but there are some Confederate people, but it's only half of Kentucky and then the states that follow Kentucky alphabetically. So if you're in Connecticut, you're out of luck. But if you are, now I'm having a hard time remembering New York, then yeah, that could be exciting. In 1900, 1910, and 1920, there were censuses for military personnel on bases and vessels. And this includes bases and vessels that were on United States, land or United States water. It also includes the people who were serving abroad. So that's kind of nice because it's this census information for people who weren't actually in the country, which of course you don't get on the general population censuses. And then in 1930, there's a merchant seaman on a vessel census, which I have a special page for because it was requested. And I think the person that requested it is the only person that I know that actually had an ancestor listed on that census. But if you are lucky enough to have somebody on that particular one, I have made a page for you and it is available. So, and then here we've got, this is the surviving soldiers, sailors, and Marines and widows, June 1890. And again, it's exciting not only because you've got, hey, people in 1890, but it's listing the widows in some cases. So you might have, women being the head of household because they're widowed, and the some information about the service of their husband. But I don't know if you can see, there's the disability incurred information at the bottom. And it matches these are a little bit hard to read, but so like if you had number 4 and then you went down, the disability incurred is malaria, poisoning, and hernia. Remarks, broken in health. So that person was not doing well. So, these can be interesting. Unable to labor, totally disabled, now quite lame. Now suffering from rheumatism. So anyway, yeah. If again, it's kind of exciting just because we have nothing for 1890. But I think so. That's all. That's all I wanted to share today. I'm going to end this recording and then we're going to see about uploading and watching it together and see if that works.